Also, this is week 3. We're going to have another 2 weeks, and then I'm going overseas again for the third time in that long. But for good things, thank God. So I'm going for the wedding. So another 2 weeks, and I'll announce next week when we're starting again. And we're doing the Sukkot one and the Sukkah, of course, like we always do. But I'll talk about that next week. Okay. So we're working through the model from the book Find Your Horizon of Healthy Thinking by Elisheva Liss. I showed it to you last week. And it's the Horizon model. I just wanted to spend a few minutes, as we always do, just to review some of the things we spoke about last week. So we've been talking about just the small challenges. Big challenges sometimes need different things, but just the small stresses of everyday life, the stuff that gets us into a bad mood or angry or resentful or jealous just from the things that happen on a day-to-day life experience, or the things that people say to us, or whatever the case is. And the model, the basic model we've been using, is the model that she brings at the very beginning of the book, the horizon model. So she talks about either being below the horizon, where just let things get us down and upset and so on, or on the horizon, where we just take things the way they are, but not good or bad. But then the goal, of course, is to transition to above the horizon, which is to reframe things and reinterpret things so that the situation doesn't change and the experience doesn't change, but we interpret it differently, we look at it differently, and our mood, our positivity, our whole emotional response and expression is much more constructive. And we've been working on the concept that it has a lot to do with the language that we use. So often the language that we use, the power of words, is able to have an effect. And we'll just review how we developed that a bit last week. So last week we expanded this concept a little bit, and we talked about the 3 garments of the expression of our soul, which is thought, speech, and action. So these are not the intellect and the emotions, the raw emotions. These are the way we express them. So even thought we can really control, but it's difficult because initial thoughts we can't really control, because initial thoughts are what comes into our mind when our initial responses happen. But speech and action are things which are in our control. They're difficult decisions sometimes to make, but they definitely are in our control, and they are things that we control, and we decide how we use them. So we decide what we say, we decide what we don't say, we decide what we do and what we don't do. Now, we talked about this concept that just like action is very powerful, because we've talked many times about this idea that acharei hamaisim mishach halevavot, which means that the heart follows the action. So when we do certain things, it changes the way we feel. The same is true with speech, and this is the thing we were emphasizing last week, that the words we say actually have an amazing effect backwards. Because even though the words are there to express what we feel, but actually when we choose the words carefully, it actually has an effect on how we feel. So that's part of the whole process of how we've been using this concept. And we talked about that doesn't always mean that we have to get ourselves to a space to be positive. Positive is not always a good thing. It's not always something we could be in a very painful or difficult experience. But she talked about the difference between positive versus healthy, right? And the very big difference, we discussed this in detail last week, about when we choose to use action or we choose to use words, is the idea that she developed, the difference between acceptance and action. So sometimes we can change things by doing things, and then we have to be constructive and take steps, healthy steps, constructive steps to change the situation that we're in, but not always that's possible. And sometimes we just have to accept, and the acceptance, but to remain above the horizon, means that we have to reinterpret and we have to use words carefully. And that was connected to that famous serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's really, really important, and sometimes we need to do both. Sometimes we first accept and then do other things, and so on. So we talked about this from a Jewish perspective, of course, because from a Jewish perspective, not all things, a lot of things we can't change, because fundamental to our thinking is that God runs the world, and that everything happens for a reason. And sometimes we can plan responsibly, as we should do, but things don't always work out the way we want them to, and that's the acceptance part. However, we do control our emotional responses, and there are actions that we do control in terms of doing the things which are morally correct to do. In other words, our moral choices are in our power, as the famous Talmudic saying, as we mentioned so many times, everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven. In other words, God gives us free choice, but in the areas of moral choice, right? So therefore we need to know the difference. When do we just accept and when do we use action? Now I just want to clarify again, when we talk about using language, right, we're not talking about affirmations. We're not talking about describing things as they aren't. We're not talking about people saying, I'm fantastic when I'm not fantastic, or I'm very, very smart when I'm not, or I'm not angry when I am. Right? That kind of thing. Those don't work normally. What it does mean is to use language that reframes, doesn't change, but reframes an experience, right? And we talked a lot about that, for example, even in our own emotional feelings. If we're feeling angry, we're feeling very, very upset, to use words about our own feeling to describe it in toned down language, and it actually eventually gets us into that space of feeling a bit different about it and so on. We also talked about the reversing the order of our story. So sometimes it's, I want to do something but, and it's where we put the but. It's like, there is a problem but I really want to do it, that kind of thing. So we gave some examples. So that's also sort of using language, reinterpreting the story, and we connected to the concept of narrative therapy, which we spoke about last week. Okay. Now, today what I want to do is I want to actually just take this a little bit further and share with you something that she talks about in the second chapter of the book. And that is the following, that this idea, right, this calmness and the reality that we create with our own language, with our own words, sometimes it's even more helpful not even to begin by reinterpreting the stimulus that's around us, right? So, for example, the example we gave last week was the guy who was having really problems with his landlord. But he had to exercise acceptance rather than action because they couldn't afford a better apartment, right? So therefore, she worked with him to reframe the interpretation of the story. Yes, it's annoying, but it's like the price you pay for cheap rent, and the whole thing became a lot more positive, and the person was able to transition to above the horizon. So that's an example of taking an experience outside of me, a stimulus outside of me, which is provoking or igniting a certain response on my part, and telling the story differently so that it makes it more positive and I'm able to accept it at least, or rise above the horizon, and it doesn't get me down and hold me down and paralyze me. But sometimes it's deeper than that. Sometimes it's about retelling our internal story. In other words, not reinterpreting the situation around us, but reinterpreting how we feel. Not how we feel in response to something else, but how we feel about ourselves even, right? And that's got a lot to do with self-perception and how we define ourselves and how we look at ourselves and so on. So to illustrate this, I'm going to share with you a case study that she has in the book, because examples and stories are always more powerful and bring out the point a lot more clear, right? So just take a few minutes to explain this and just to go through what she went through with a particular client of hers. So she talks about, changes the names obviously, but she talks about a woman called Shari, who was an intelligent person, who, however, gone through a tough time, marriage issues, relationship issues, self-image problems, and so on and so forth. And she'd be working a long time with her to try to get her into a better space. And she says that one day she comes in to the session looking very different, looking much happier, looking much positive. And she says to Elisha Wallace, the author of the book, she says, I finally turned the corner. And she was very happy with herself. So what actually happened? So she gives a bit of background first. She says, first of all, just to explain who this was a person who had gone through a lot of issues. She'd grown up in an environment, obviously an environment which we grow up in affects us a lot. Her mother was the eldest daughter of survivors. Her mother was a very harsh person. She and her siblings, learned when they grew up to do everything just very quietly, but nothing was ever good enough, and so on. I'm just paraphrasing some of this. And then as an adult, she continued to push herself and to try and be successful, but always very harsh on herself, always judging herself, always undermining herself, right? This reflected in the workplace, so she had a very good job, but any imperfection, she used to berate herself, put herself down and so on. So this Elishava was working with her to sort of reframe herself, to feel better about herself, and apparently not making a lot of progress. So she says on that Wednesday, she knew that she got it. Why? The story was like this. She she and her family had spent a long weekend. I'm going to read this paragraph to you. She said, she and her family had spent a long weekend out of town, reconnecting with an old friend. Her friend was the same age as she. In fact, they'd been classmates. They had similar lives, both married with 3 young kids, similar jobs, homes, incomes, and backgrounds. But Shari noticed an important difference. She saw that even though their kids were the same age and their homes were similar in size, her friend Ricky's home seemed to run much more smoothly and effectively. It was set up in a more user-friendly way, more organized, logical. The children were trained with specific tasks, more capable, more helpful, and had more structured activities than in Shari's home. Right? You know how you go, sometimes you see, we think everyone else is doing it a lot better than we are. And yet, she came away very happy. And the question was, so why was she so happy? Right? So she says the following. In the past, a weekend like this would have been very painful for her. Her mind would have been filled with thoughts of inferiority or shame, such as, she's got it all together, I'm all over the place, I've got no excuse, we have the same life, and so on and so forth. Maybe she should raise my kids for me, and all these kind of, I'm just a loser, that kind of thing, right? By the way, it doesn't always happen that response, sometimes the other way around. Sometimes, when we're very insecure and put ourselves down, either we berate ourselves or we reinterpret, we reinterpret the other person. We say, she's so arrogant, she thinks she's so clever, really, I know what's going on behind the scene, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's either about protecting ourselves and putting the other person down, or putting ourselves down. Really, it's all the same response, right? Okay, but this was her, this would have been her response. And instead, she says she found herself being inspired and uplifted and able to learn from her friend. She was thinking much more productive thoughts like, wow, Ricky has a really great system in place and her life situation is very similar to mine. There's no reason why I can't implement a lot of these ideas and enjoy some of the benefits. I'm really happy to get a front row seat at this life efficiency seminar. Right? I'm catching up with an old friend, learning some great parenting and homemaking tips all at the same time. Right? So what she explained to her therapist is that she actually discussed this with her friend, right? And told her that she wanted to ask her, and she learned from her. So she was feeling very fulfilled and very happy, because what she originally would have done at the very beginning of their working together, it would have been a very bleak and negative response. But because she'd learned the art of reinterpreting things, and this time it wasn't about reinterpreting the experience on the outside, because the experience on the outside was a positive one to begin with, right? So in other words, it wasn't reinterpreting, a guy cuts me off in traffic, well, I reinterpreted, maybe he's stressed out or he didn't see, or whatever the case is. It's not about judging favorably or reframing. It's not about that at all. It was about writing her own script differently. It was about using the words in her thoughts or verbally to create a language where I'm not a loser, I understand my intrinsic self-worth, and it's wonderful to be able to learn from other people. It's a very different script, right? Hard script to write, but a very, very powerful one, right? So in her book, what she does is she takes a story and just goes back to the model of the 3 ways to be in terms of the horizon and breaks it down like this. So she says, a below the horizon response would have been, Ricky is capable and creative, I'm incompetent and sloppy, her home and family are so well tended, reminds me of what a lousy job I'm doing with mine. I really hate this stuff, right? So just down in the dumps, feeling bad, putting ourselves down, and so on and so forth. On the horizon would just be to describe the thing, but above the horizon is watching Ricky's homemaking and parenting shows me that there are lots of great ideas she uses that maybe I can learn from. It's a bit humbling to see how much better she is than I am, but spending time with her, observing her and discussing with her will allow me to pick up some tips and habits that could really enhance my home. It may sound like a small deal, but it can make a tremendous difference in the quality of life. Right? So obviously, this kind of work, this kind of response, obviously has a lot to do with not just language, it has a lot to do with changing our mindset and a whole perspective on ourselves, right? It goes to the heart of something we've talked about so many times, the concept of self-esteem, healthy self-esteem, the concept of understanding our self-worth, and really goes to the heart of the whole idea of how we define ourselves, right? Because it really, in other words, how do we define ourselves? Do we define ourselves, just to review that briefly, do we define ourselves, as many people do and as we do sometimes to ourselves, by how we compare to others? Do we define ourselves by how other people are looking at us? How people perceive ourselves? Do we perceive us? Do we define ourselves by our outer layers of function? our achievements, the things that we can do, the things that we're good at or not good at? Is that how we define ourselves? Or do we define ourselves by our intrinsic value, right? That really goes to the heart of all that. So, of course, it's got to do with that. And there's a lot of work that goes into shifting that paradigm of how we define ourselves, and to come to that conclusion that we all have intrinsic value. We have the core of our soul that's pure. We have capabilities, we have competencies, and that things that we do wrong and mistakes we make, don't define us and don't make us into bad people and don't weaken us. On the contrary, the growth mindset we talked about, mistakes we make are really tools for learning, things that we can improve in the future, amazing opportunities, and so on and so forth. Which is exactly what she did. However, it becomes so much easier if we learn to use the right language. And this, I guess, is the point of what we're discussing. It's about verbalizing it properly. Because speech creates. Speech actually creates a reality. And this is going back to what we spoke about before, the power of words. Now, of course, it's not just the words. We have to look at our own ego, we have to look at our own insecurities, we have to look at how we define ourselves, we have to look at our perspective on life, our perspective on values, and so on and so forth. But if we have a basic idea where we want to get to, words carry us there. I think I once gave you this example that's brought down in some of the works of mysticism, that words are like a horse and a rider. So when you get onto a horse, the horse is going to go where you take it, right? Where you lead it, that's where it's going to go. Same thing with words. Words are just going to express what you put into the words. Words are nothing. Words are considered empty things, really, if you think about it. You can make up nonsense words too. But words, however, are like, in other words, words will only say what you put into them. But, like the horse and the rider, although the rider is in control of where to lead the horse gets the rider there a lot faster than the rider can go themselves, right? Which is a positive and a negative. In other words, if I get onto a horse and I go the wrong way, it's going to get me to the wrong way a lot quicker than I could have walked there, and get me what they call in Yiddish verblonget, a lot quicker, lost a lot quicker, right? However, if I want to go somewhere and I know where I'm going, and that's where I steer the horse, it'll get me there a lot faster. And that's the power of words. So obviously, it's not just about using the words, but the power of words cannot be underestimated. The power of words is if I tell a different story about myself. So what she did was, the story she told about herself is, I don't need to feel bad. I don't need to feel inferior. On the contrary, I need to just understand, redefine myself. I need to understand that, wow, God just put me in a really, really lucky position. I've landed in a weekend where I'm having a holiday, plus I'm getting a free parenting seminar, and there's a lot that I can learn, and there's so many things I can pick up, and I can implement when I go back, or at least I can aspire to, I can try. It's about telling that story differently. But this time, it's not about telling the story of the outside stuff, it's telling the story of my own story. The story of how I feel about myself and how I'm planning to respond to what is happening on the outside. Is that making sense? Yeah? I want to just share with you an amazing thing about power of words, just while we're on the topic. So, I'll be reading another book called, what's it called? Optimism Bias. It's just been written really, really recently. It came out, in fact, in honor of the yard site, which happened a few weeks ago, the day of passing of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And we know the Lubavitcher Rebbe had a very strong bias towards optimism. That was his whole life, right? Everything was always about looking at the good side of things. So there's a whole chapter there. And I know this because, I know this to be true because I spent many years by the Rebbe listening to his talks and learning his works and so on and so forth, watching videos of him and so on. So what the person describes, but he describes it very, very beautifully in the book and puts it all together very nicely, is the Rebbe's extreme, and I mean that with emphasis, extreme obsession with positive speech. Right? Now, it's based on Torah ideas and Jewish ideas, which I'll share with you in a second, but the concept that the Rebbe was so particular whenever possible, even when he had to say something harsh, which happened, as a leader you need to do that a lot of times, even when he had to say something which had negative aspects to it, he'd always go to the most tremendous lengths to use positive speech, even in a very nuanced way. And part of that is because, first of all, he based it on a Torah idea. We find it in the Torah. For example, we know that in the Chumash, every word is used carefully. Yet, in the story of the flood, where God tells Noah to take into the ark a number of animals, right? And he says, he needed to take 2 of each animal and then 7 of each kosher animal. The commentaries explain to us that Noah had foresight knowledge of some of the laws of the Torah, and the way it refers to in the Torah, the word kosher, non-kosher actually is a made-up word. It means something else. Just we use it for things that we can eat and things we can't eat. But in the Torah, when it comes to animals, actually, later on when it lays down the law in a much more succinct and clear way, the word for kosher animals is tehorah, pure. The word for a non-kosher animal is teme'ah, which means impure, right? And yet in the flood, where God tells Noah to take in the animals to the teva, he says, and from all the pure animals you should take 7. But for all the animals asher einenu tehorah, that are not pure, it doesn't say that are impure, he says that are not pure, right? Because the Torah doesn't want to use the word teme'ah, because it's not such a nice language. I mean, it means what it means, but it means impure. But the Torah sort of adds extra words, adds extra sentences sometimes in order to talk in a bit of a roundabout way, so language comes up more positive. And the Rebbe would mention this many, many times, and this sort of sheds a bit of light to his approach. So I'll tell you a couple of stories and a couple of ideas that sort of bring this out, but they have amazing. I'm just not sharing with you because they are the stories. I'm sharing with you because it goes to the lesson of what we've been talking about, how words create reality, how words sometimes can bring hope or the opposite of hope, how words can really propel us into a space, either positive or not, and therefore we need to use our words carefully, right? So one story which I remember when it happened. Every few years when Lag BaOmer would come out on a Sunday, so as you know, this Rebbe was very into the education of children and instilling Jewish pride, so they used to have this massive Lag BaOmer parade, right? Which now they do all over the world, but it started in New York, and it was it would bring thousands of kids with counselors. It was a very, very big production, and the Rebbe himself would come out. The Rebbe loved talking to kids. He would come out and he would address the children. So everyone would assemble, and there would be these beautiful floats that the organization built, and it was amazing. So the fellow who used to run these parades, his name was Rabbi Hecht. Rabbi J.J. Hecht, his name was. Rabbi Yaakov Yehuda Hecht. A very fascinating human being, a very fiery, amazing guy. So he used to put us together. One year, he had a lot of complications leading up to parade. There were funding issues, there were administrative issues, and he used to keep the Rebbe updated. And if he was in a bad mood, he would tell the Rebbe. He had a very interesting relationship. Like he would write a letter to the Rebbe, things aren't going well, I need a blessing, whatever the case is, anyway. And just before the parade, he was very nervous, and he kind of looked at stuff with a bit of a jaded eye, like he didn't think the floats were nice enough. He's not sure how many kids were going to show up from different schools. And so anyway, it turned out a massive success. The kids came, the floats were there, the Rebbe came out, he talked to the kids, and you could see the Rebbe was really enjoying it, and he was happy, and so on. So at the end of the parade, I remember this, I was actually there, and he turned, first of all, he thanked all the organizers, and then he turned around to the Rebbe, and he asked the Rebbe if he enjoyed the event. And the Rebbe said, very much. So he turned to the Rebbe and he said, this is such a nuanced thing, so listen to this. He said to the Rebbe, he thanked the Rebbe, he said, the Rebbe hat mir a Ruis geschleppt. The Rebbe schlepped me out. In other words, he schlepped me out of my dark place. And the Rebbe, you couldn't actually hear it on the mic, you could hear it afterwards when it's recording, but I remember, because I was watching it, I remember the Rebbe going like this. The Rebbe said, a Ruis geschleppt, aufgeheben. Which means, don't say, I schlepped you out, say, lifted you up. Why? It's an amazing thing. The emphasis on language. A Ruis geschleppt means I'm in a dark place. Right, I got to schlep you out. But that's already putting yourself, you're starting off from a darker place. You're starting off a negative place, right? The Rebbe didn't feel that the difficulties he had warranted to be called in a dark place, right? He said, you're thanking me for shifting you along, that's fine, but aufgeheben. In other words, you started good. I just took it a bit higher. Not a risk geschlepp, but aufgeheben, right? Those kind of little things, right? This is actually not in the book, but I heard a recording of this. President Shazar, who was once the president of Israel, had a very close relationship with the Rebbe, and he came to visit the Rebbe a few times. And there's one recording. President Shazar came in Russia from a Chabad family. He went on to become the president of Israel afterwards, and he wasn't a Chabad follower, so to speak, but he had a very close relationship with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and they would meet, and there was a real friendship between them. So there's one recording where there's like a bunch of people around, and he comes and he sits down with the Rebbe, and he had a very beautiful Yiddish. Obviously in Israel, the official language he spoke was Hebrew, But when he conversed with the Rebbe, they spoke in their Mama Lashon, they spoke in Yiddish, a very, as they call a zaftige Yiddish, a really, really good Yiddish. Anyway, so they start talking about the youth of today, meaning the youth they were talking about, not the youth anymore, but they were describing the problems with the youth. So President Salazar had a very rich Jewish background and he knew a lot. So he says to the Rebbe, in Yiddish, but I'll translate, he says that one of the things that's really bothering him about the youth today is the amaratzis. Amaratzis is a Hebrew Yiddish word, basically means ignorance, the ignorance. The ignorance of today's youth. Like, they don't know anything, right? So the Rebbe got a little bit shaken, and the Rebbe says, we shouldn't call it amaratzis, we should call it pashtus, which means don't call it ignorance, call it simplicity. Why? There's a world of difference. Ignorance is a negative thing, right? But ignorance is a negative thing which doesn't emphasize right away the opportunity. Pashtus, simplicity is the best translation I can think of, but pashtus actually means there's like a simplicity with a purity almost. Innocence, right? Innocence, like almost like a clean slate. In other words, he wasn't in denial. The Rebbe was very much aware of the world's problems. But he saw every problem as an opportunity. And for him, the way you turn it into an opportunity was to use the right language. He says, don't call it amaratzis, call it pashtus. And actually, it's an interesting little day because he didn't chap that the Rebbe was really serious, and he continued on and he used it again. And the Rebbe stopped him and said, it was very respectful to him, but he said, Zog pashtus. He said, say pashtus. And he agreed afterwards. Like, that it wouldn't let him go. He wouldn't let him use the word. Why? Not that he was in denial of the problem. There is a lot of lack of knowledge. That's the truth. And lack of education is a serious, serious problem for any form of Jewish continuity. It always has been and it always will be. That because education is who we are, right? And therefore, if there's a generation where lack of knowledge becomes a problem, it's a problem and it's an urgent problem and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. But you need to address it like an opportunity, not like a problem. And when you say that someone has innocence or simplicity, what you're saying is they don't know a lot, but there's purity there. There's an opportunity. It's a clean slate. There's potential. It emphasizes the amazing potential, right? Now, of course, this concept was very, very much based in, from a Jewish perspective, based in the works of Kabbalah, right? There's many, many sources in Kabbalah where we talk about that language defines things, language creates a reality. We know that when people use words, every word that we say creates an energy, creates a spiritual flow of something. Sometimes we can't right away see it in the physical realm, but we can. Those who could. But it's something that's there. We've created something because just like God created the world with language, He gave human beings the creative power. In other words, language is something that God used, God created in order to be the tools of creation. And He gave language to the human beings, but language remained the tool of creation. Of course, we're not God and we can't create like God. But actually, we shouldn't underestimate the power of creation that we do have. And that is that when we use words, and words are the tools of creation, we actually create something. If we use positive language, we create positive realities. Now again, we don't create realities that aren't there, that God does. Right? We don't create what we call in Hebrew yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing. But what we do is we create a difference in the reality that already exists. So we interpret the reality that is already there, creating a new reality. So that the facts on the ground become a new thing. They become a new reality. Right? Now what's amazing, which she brings, which I didn't research a lot, but I'm trying to find the way. Yeah, there are two people who do a lot of studies on this apparently. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg, I don't know if anyone's heard of him, and a guy called Professor Robert Waldman, that they actually did research about the power of language, and they found an amazing thing. They said that they have a book called Words Can Change Your Brain, right? And they say, for example, they did MRI scans, right? And they discovered that when people use negative language, it actually affects the part of the brain that is the fear center of the brain. So it increases stress. The very language increases stress, which is not new from a Jewish perspective, actually. I mean, this is in Jewish sources a long time ago. As I always tell you, many of these things are always there. But it's amazing how scientifically it was now studied, right? When you vocalize your negativity, even more stress chemicals will be released, not only in your brain, but in the listener's brain as well. So it's an interesting thing in terms of relationships. So when you stress that and you verbalize it in a negative way, you increase your own stress, and that's been measured by brain activity, and increase the stress of the people listening, which is an amazing thing, by the way, because not just the language that we use that creates realities for ourselves, it creates a reality in the world. And when we talk to someone, we actually affect them as well, right? Which is interesting because it goes to the heart of what the Talmud says. The Talmud says that when we talk Lashon Hara, we talk evil speech or gossip or negative speech and so on, we affect three people. It says it affects three people. It affects the person who's saying it, the person who is being said about, and the listener. Right? So, we understand. So in other words, that just shows you how much of a reality. Now, when we say it affects the person who's been spoken about, by the way, it doesn't only mean because I said something not nice about him or her and therefore I ruined their reputation. Even if no one ever finds out about it. The fact that I said something negative about someone has a reality. The fact that I'm saying it to someone affects the person I'm talking to negatively. Obviously, it affects me as well because I'm saying it. And that's why the Talmud says that Lashon Hara affects three people. Because it creates such a power, such an energy, such a flow, that actually it affects not only me, but it's now present in the world, and that it affects the people I'm talking to as well, and even the people I'm talking about, which is an amazing, amazing concept, right? And then they went on to say that studies have shown that the positive words, such as peace and love, can actually alter the expression of genes and strengthening areas in our frontal lobes and promoting the brain's cognitive functioning. Most amazing things about using positive speech, how it even affects positively our processing ability in terms of how we process information and so on and so forth. Going back to the Talmud, we find many mitzvot in the Torah that have to do with speech, right? So for example, prayer actually has to do with this week's Torah portion. We have a very important mitzvah in the Torah to pray, right? Where's the source of this mitzvah? So interestingly enough, the source of the mitzvah to pray is from this week's parsha, and it doesn't say there to pray. When we think of praying, how do we think of the word praying? What's the imagery? We say words of prayer, right? The source of prayer actually comes from a verse that doesn't talk about speech altogether. It says, "Ula'avda b'chol levavchem," to serve God with your heart. In other words, the essence of prayer really is the reflection, it's the meditation, it's the emotion that comes behind the prayer, right? It's the emotional connection to God. It's a service of the heart. That's where we know the concept of prayer. That's why feeling and kavanah and intention when we pray is so important, not just saying the words. Yet, at the same time, the Torah mandates, right, which is a bit different to general practice in the world, so to speak. But in the Torah, there's a very specific law that when you pray, you actually have to say the words. Why? Because the words have such power. So obviously, you've got to try and inject that feeling into the words. But when you take your feeling, when you take your emotional connection and you put it into verbalization, it carries it so much further. Right? We have the idea of nedarim, of vows, the incredible emphasis in the Torah about keeping your word. Right? So much so that there's a practice some people have, even if they don't promise, even if they don't take a vow, but if someone says, "I'm going to do something," there's an expression some people use that it's called bli neder, which means I'm going to do it, but I'm specifically not promising because I'm not sure I can do it, right? Because apparently to say that you're going to do something and not to keep the word is a terrible thing spiritually, because words have such power. Because when I say I'm going to do something, it creates a real bond. I'm binding myself to it. It creates a commitment, right? Just examples from that's the book, by the way. Just examples from the Talmud of the Torah about the importance of words. Just to give a couple other things, just amazing about how words send energy, and positive or negative, right? A very, very famous thing. The Rebbe had this real issue with the modern Hebrew expression for hospitals. Right? In Hebrew, modern Hebrew, a hospital is a bet chalim. He refused to call it a bet chalim, and in fact he encouraged certain administrators of hospitals to change the name. I know of one that was once in Sydney who built a religious hospital in Bnei Brak. Not a member of the Hasidic community at all, but he said he'd gone to the Rebbe for advice, and the Rebbe asked him, begged him not to call it a hospital, not to call it a bet chalim, and he changed it. The Rebbe would always refer to a hospital as bet refuah, place of healing. Right? And it wasn't just semantics. Because the Rebbe held that if you say the words bet refuah, which means you're giving hope, right? Imagine a person going into a hospital and he says, "Where are you?" "I'm in bet chalim, a place of sickness." Right? That in itself is a negative energy. Right? Bet refuah means I'm in a place of healing. I'm here to become better. We know in modern day medicine, in modern day science, we know that the positive mindset of someone that's not well is so important and has an effect on the physical, right? So that was like a thing. And similarly, one of the things, and this goes back to the discussion we've been having now in that story I told you before, that it was would push back on someone that would define themselves in a negative way. So he tells a story that a man came to the Rebbe and he said, Rebbe, something must be wrong with me, and began to bemoan his spiritual state of being. So the Rebbe said, just as it's forbidden to speak disparagingly about someone else, even if one speaks the absolute truth, it is forbidden to speak negatively about oneself. Now that doesn't mean, right? See, this is an important thing here. The Rebbe said never to put yourself down. That doesn't mean you shouldn't know your own weaknesses. On the contrary. It's all about growth, and it's all about you have to know where your weaknesses are and improve them and take on step. But it's not about describing yourself as negative. The fact that we have weaknesses is a part of life, and it's not a bad thing. The fact that we all have areas we could grow in is okay, and we should be honest about it. Soon we come into the month of Elul, we've talked about a lot of times. That's the Jewish month of reflection, where we're supposed to take stock and identify our strengths, identify our weaknesses, but not to define ourselves as a weakness, not to define ourselves as a negative thing, but rather to I have weaknesses, but I have a soul, I have potential. God believes in me, He trusts me, and I'm going to take a step forward to change and to improve and to do something better in the coming year. Right? Different message, but different message creates a different energy. This concept, by the way, about not talking disparagingly about yourself, is rooted in a very famous story of a great sage who lived before the war called the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim was a very, very famous sage, and he was very well known for his books on the subject of gossip. He fought very strongly to create awareness of people not speaking bad about other people, right? I mean, there's all kinds of laws, and of course sometimes we have to because there's a purpose to it and so on, but this concept of not gossiping. So he was once on a train. By the way, his name wasn't the Chafetz Chaim, his name was Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan. The reason it was called the Chafetz Chaim is based on the verse in Tehillim and Psalms where it says Chafetz Chaim means a person who desires life. And King David says, Mi ha'ish, who is the person that desires longevity in life, if not to talk badly about other people. That's right. So because he was so into this, he was called the Chafetz Chaim. So the Chafetz Chaim was once on a train, and he was coming home from a journey, and he was going to his town. The town was Radin. That's where he lived. And on the compartment there was another simple Jew there, and he got talking to him. So there was no pictures in those days like there are today. So the Chafetz Chaim says to this person, where you headed? Where's your destination? He said, I'm going to Radin. Oh, so I'm also going to Radin. So Chafetz Chaim says to him, why are you going to Radin? He said, because I want to go and visit the Chafetz Chaim. Not having an idea that he's talking to the Chafetz Chaim. Right? So the Chafetz Chaim was quite a humble person. He said to him, why do you want to go visit the Chafetz Chaim? He says, are you mad? Chafetz Chaim is well known, such a great sage, such a big tzaddik, person of inspiration. Chafetz Chaim says he's not so big, he's not so great, he's not what people make out of him, and he spoke negatively. The guy got so upset that he gave him a patch. Later on, he comes to Radin, and the Chafetz Chaim gets ended the conversation. Comes to Radin and he goes to the shul of the Chafetz Chaim, and he sees the same guy. He felt so bad, didn't know what to do. So he came, he made an appointment with the Chafetz Chaim. He says, "I'm sorry, I have to apologize. Gosh, I can't believe what I did. I actually slapped you." Chafetz Chaim says, "Don't worry. It was because of you that I learned a very important law on the laws of Lashon Hara. And that is that just as it's forbidden to speak about other people badly, you're not supposed to speak about yourself badly either. I learned it from you. Thank you very much." That's what we're talking, right? So this concept about not speaking about it, but just to take it to this, in this context, it's about when we speak badly about ourselves, it might be very nice, it might be very humble, it might seem very humble, we might feel good about it sometimes, but it's not because we create a reality. When we speak disparagingly about ourselves, we're creating negativity within ourselves. And that then has a tremendous impact on how we respond and how we talk. One final thing, which is my favorite story actually, just how we look at the world, amazing. So you know that the world, we've talked about this before, the world is created into 4 parts. The domem, which are, well, this is the point of how to translate this, but when I normally tell you, I always say it's inanimate things, right? Like stones and minerals and so on and so forth. Someach. Oh, that was a picture of that. Right? Tzomeach, which means things that grow. Chai, the animal kingdom, and Medaber, the communicator, the human being. So, a number of years ago, there's a rabbi, he's still alive, his name is Rabbi Mangel, and he was commissioned to translate one of the seminal books of Chabad philosophy, which is the book of the Tanya, right? Okay. And the Rebbe oversaw this project, and he would translate and then send things into the Rebbe. One of the sections of Tanya, the first Chabad Rebbe, Rav Shnei Zalman of Ladi, he discusses the following idea. He says, his idea is like this, is that not only human beings, but everything in the world has a soul. Why? Because the concept is that when God created the world using words, He infused these words into the creations. So, for example, when He said, let there be heaven, or let there be trees, whatever, right? There's a divine spark that is infused into that creation, and that divine spark didn't just create the world and then leave it. The point there, the thesis there is that God recreates the world every second, every moment. Which means the divine spark which is in the creation gives it life energy all the time, right? And then he brings from the Arizal, the famous Kabbalist, the Arizal, this is true about every single creation, va'afilu domem, even the stones, the rocks, things that, right? Okay. So when this guy translated it, he translated as domem, as we normally do, inanimate. And the Rebbe said that first of all it's inaccurate, second of all it's negative. Why? The word domem actually doesn't mean inanimate. In Hebrew, the word domem means silent. Inanimate means it has no life. He says you can't say that. When you look at a stone, stone has life. The stone has spirituality, the stone has a soul. What you could say about the stone is that it's a domem, it's silent. Right? That's very different. And he was very insistent about this because he says the whole attitude is different. When you look at something that's lifeless, it means it has no potential. It has no vibrancy. It has nothing you can do with it. Right? Again, such an unbelievable nuance about difference of language. When you say something is silent, you're not saying it has no life, you're just saying it's silent. In other words, that is true. Part of the world God created where the life force, the godliness, the spark, the soul is not apparent. It's silent. Right? Things that grow, a tree that grows, you can see life. An animal that you can see life. A human being you can see life. But a stone you can't. It's very difficult. It's silent. It doesn't mean it has no life. So anyway, what he did was, the translator was very hesitant to end the story. The translator was very hesitant because he didn't think silent was a good sophisticated translation. He thought inanimate was much more sophisticated. So when he translated it, he translated domem, he said the word inanimate, and in brackets he put silent. And he sent the proof into the Rebbe for checking. So the Rebbe left it, but he took the brackets and put it, he said he changed it around. He translated the word domem as silent, and in brackets he put inanimate. He said, no, we're going to still say silent is going to be the main translation. No, he saw that he wanted to keep inanimate there because people would relate to that word better. For understanding purposes, perhaps that would be a more common translation. But let's keep the main translation as silence, because silent means it's got life, it's got opportunity, it's got potential. You know, just as words becoming a creative force, it's very interesting. I don't know if you know this, but I mean, it has a negative connotation to it too. But you know the magic word abracadabra. You know where it comes from? No. It comes from Aramaic, which is the Talmud's language, right? And Aramaic has similarities to Hebrew, right? Abra comes from the word briat, is to create. Dabra means dibur, which is speaking, right? Which is why it's like imagine abracadabra. I'm going to create by speech. I'm going to say it's going to be, it's going to happen, right? Now, it has very negative origins and connotations that because in ancient times where witchcraft was practiced, the idea was that a human being can create. Now, of course, human beings can't create because only God is the creator. But everything has a positive message as well, and this is a positive message to understand that actually, on a certain level, it is true. Every time we speak, we create. The word for dibur, the word for speech in Hebrew is davar. A word is davar, and davar also means a thing, an existence. So every time we say a davar, every time we say a word, we're actually creating a thing. We're creating an existence. Anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you because I think it emphasizes the importance of this concept. But going back to today's topic, therefore, this usage of language and this reinterpretation of stories, as we talked about last week, has then a tremendous effect on how we interpret our own story. how we create our own reality, right? Which goes to the story we started off with about being in a, someone else was doing parenting better than she was, and so on and so forth. And it goes to the heart of jealousy. Right? And we know that jealousy, for example, is a terrible thing, right? We've talked about this before, and we've talked about negative emotions. Jealousy is a bad thing. But jealousy is not a bad thing necessarily. It depends what we do with it, right? And there's a part in the book where she talks about, she says, the only difference between jealousy and learning from others is our mood. Right? Depends where we are on the horizon. In other words, learning from others is good jealousy. Aspiring to be like others on value-based living, and to learn things we can learn from other people, whether it's how to parent, or how to run a house, or how to organize something, or how to be a good person, or do kindness, whatever the case is. There's absolutely nothing wrong. Not only that, it's actually a good thing. As the Talmud says, we mentioned this before, Kinat Sofrim Tar B'Chochmah. The jealousy among the wise creates wisdom, or increases wisdom. Because when you're jealous of someone in a positive way, you say, wow, a person can achieve so much in their learning, in their study, I'm sure I can do the same. Let me try, right? That's positive jealousy. Jealousy is an incredibly good thing. Bad jealousy is an incredibly bad thing. The Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, tells us that jealousy, lust, and pursuit of glory is destructive, destroys us, right? Takes us away from the world. So jealousy can be an unbelievable thing, and can be a terrible thing. And it can be the same story. In other words, it can be the same set of facts. She could have been incredibly jealous and put herself down, or self-destroyed, or been very negative towards the other person, and it could have actually destroyed the relationship, really, as jealousy often does. Or jealousy could be channeled into an amazing story of, wow, thank you, I'm going to learn from you. Show me how you do that, and let me learn from you. I'm not a bad person, I'm just learning how to do something better. I'm aspiring to learn from someone else who obviously has mastered this particular area. I want to be able to do that too, and that's great. We know that good jealousy means we don't put the other person down. Good jealousy means we're not upset about the other person having what they have. We're just aspiring to emulate that, right? All aspects of good jealousy. What can be the absolute defining difference between good jealousy and bad jealousy is how we tell the story, the words that we use, the interpretation of the story. That's it. That's what about. And because, she says the difference between good jealousy and bad jealousy is the mood that we're in. But that mood is tremendously affected by how we tell the story, and how we tell the story about ourselves, and how we define ourselves, and the kind of energy we create. And as going back to last week, and this is so unbelievably true, but so powerful yet so hard sometimes, we just have to catch ourselves in the right time, and force ourselves to tell the story in a proper way, to use the right language, to use language of hope, language of love, language of positivity, language of opportunity, right? And when we use that language, it's like the horse. We are the rider, and the language is the horse. And the horse takes us to that place very, very quickly. Just a matter of getting ourselves used to interpreting the story in a positive way. So in the case of jealousy, it's about interpreting our own story. It's about, I see that person has that characteristic. I see that person has that quality. I see that person has the skill. I don't have that. They obviously have it in a much better way than I do, but that's fine. I'm okay. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. On the contrary, it means I have in front of me an amazing opportunity to learn from someone that does it better, or learn from someone that's already mastered it, right? Sometimes just a matter of using those words, catching ourselves in time to use those words, and it's the usage of those words that help us see good, help us create a positive energy, and help us see a potential rather than a problem. But the language in this case, as I said, language always works. It works even when we're interpreting the story on the outside of us, but it certainly also works of how we define ourselves, and we create our own internal reality. And that's the power of this aspect of this discussion. So that's a few really important parts about the story we tell, and about how it helps us carry us above the horizon. There's some more aspects to this whole discussion, which please God will do over the next 2 weeks. Just a couple of things before you go. If I just ask you, I explained before why we came to the front.